Hello, lovely beings. I'm JJ Rose. This is going to be the first of 3 episodes. So, this is going to lay some of the groundwork for episodes 2 and 3. It is going to be a lengthy episode, so hang in there with me if you will, but it will be worth it in the end. I did a lot of research and a lot of study in order to make sure that I'm citing my sources and I have dates and times for you all to really get this concept clear. And this concept is our friendly visitors. So I had originally started talking about some of this on the Uncomfortable podcast episode named Indrid Cold. But I thought I would go further on this subject with some other friendly visitors throughout time and how they correlate to one another. And I'm going to start off with a refresher on Indrid, but I do advise you to please listen to the Uncomfortable podcast episode if you want a little bit more information than I'm providing here. Indrid Cold was first talked about in the Mothman Prophecies by Keel, and then later in Woodrow Derenberger's book, Visitors from Lanulos, and then again in Tanya Derenberger's book, Beyond Lanulos. Those of you who had watched the show Hellier will probably remember them going to visit Tanya and talk to her a little bit in regards to her father's visitation with Indrid Cold. So Indrid Cold first appears to Woody Derenberger. I'm going to call him Woody from here on because it's a little bit easier. This was on November 2nd of 1966. Around 7 p.m. on Highway 77, yes, giggle, 777, Woody was driving home and a car behind him was going really fast. So he basically pulled over a lane in order to let them by, being a nice driver that he was. And then next to him, he sees this huge kerosene lamp spaceship that basically skirts in front of him and forces him to stop because it's blocking the road, somewhat diagonal. So Woody basically goes to the side of the road and stops and just is looking at this thing with surprise and shock and probably all the feels that one would get if there's a giant spaceship blocking the road. Out of the spaceship came a man, and telepathically he told Woody to roll his window down. And so Indrid introduced himself basically by saying telepathically, do not be frightened. You can think or you can speak, whichever is easier for you. Now, this is the first contact, and it leads to a friendship and many subsequent visitations. Like I said, I went very deep into this on the podcast episode from Uncomfortable, labeled Indrid Cold. So if you want more, that's great. If you want to read those books, highly recommend. All of them are great. So part of why I wanted to kind of recap on this, I really want to bring to the forefront a couple things that Woody experienced on his journeys. The first was while he was taken to the planet Lanulos, he described it pretty much just like Earth. There are streams, there are fields, there's woods, and apparently most of the same animals. There's very few exceptions of animals being different or us having something that Lanulos doesn't. Woody is given foods there that taste similar to foods he's accustomed to, but he said it was a different type of food from their planet. Like, i.e., we would call it meat, and they call it something else. They didn't eat any junk food on Lanulos, only fresh and organic whole foods. They're allowed to take whatever they need from the store, nothing more, nothing less. Woody, while he was on Lanulos, was not allowed to touch anything in the store for fear of contamination. Which is interesting, because not only is he on this other planet, but he's seeing that they have homes like us. They have stores like us, except they don't have a monetary system like us. Everyone just takes what they need, and that's it. They eat very fresh, very organic, whole foods. Not the store, but, actual, whole, perfect foods. According to Indrid, they have 3 seasons on their planet: planting, harvesting, and cold. Their life expectancy is equivalent to 125 to 175 Earth years. Now, this was interesting. On Lanulos, people were limited to bearing 2 children due to overpopulation concerns, but there was no limit on additional adopted children, which is kind of interesting because, okay, well, if people are living that long and there's very little disease and illness, how are people passing away? And Indrid basically explains there are times when people crash in their ships, or if there's wars, or if they go other places and they get, caught by the people there, then they're not coming back and their children need to be adopted out. Now, going a little bit further into the belief systems, one thing that Indrid speaks about is that they cannot understand the word hate, which is interesting, right? Because obviously on our planet, that's something we know far too much about. They are taught in Lanulos from childhood that all people are their brothers and sisters. It doesn't matter who they are, where they're from, etc. We are all God's children. And they truly believe that all people are equal. Just let that sink in a little bit. These people look like us. They have things like us. They eat, they sleep, they drink water, just cleaner. They don't understand hate. They can talk telepathically, and they believe all people are equal. So obviously this is in the mid-60s. So Woody asked them about religion and spiritual beliefs. And he's told that they have only one religion, and that is all people are God's children. Interesting. Indrid tells Woody that if we, humans on Earth, had telepathy, or what I call transference, meaning that you're transferring your thought, your emotion to another person without having to say the words, that Earth would not have wars nor hate because all people would be able to understand each other, and therefore no misunderstandings would occur. There's also something that he describes as a guiding council, which is comprised of representatives of different worlds. Each planet, now hear me out, there are multiple planets that these people live on and come from. And they all talk. And they have a guiding council in which each planet elects their own representative via a popular vote. The highest individual in the guiding council is no better than the average person. This intergalactic circle benefits all planets to share technology, medicine, engineering, and it studies each world's problems and then recommends a way to improve them. This guiding council or intergalactic circle never uses force. It only recommends way to improve that planet and their civilization, and then they leave it be. Now, everyone on Lanulos works jobs according to their ability, and they're given all that they need. There's no material advantage over others. Everyone is paid according to the size of their family. They're paid in either credits or scripts. Scripts is basically for store inventory. So there's not a monetary system like we have on this planet. And then we get into a layered reality, because if you think about it, in Woody's experience, it really only took him 15 minutes to get from Earth to this other planet, where he needed no breathing apparatus, no special suit, no nothing. He did have to take a decontamination shower and put on a different suit, but isn't that interesting that supposedly another planet that's distant from us, you're able to breathe there, you're able to eat the food there, your gravity is adjusted just like it was another version of Earth, or maybe it was Earth just on another dimensional plane, which this makes a little bit more sense if you think about it, because he never really left the planet per se. He just shifted into another version of it. So you're probably wondering, okay, Indrid Cold, Lanulos, interesting. But wait, there's more. As I said, this is going to be a longer episode. So serendipitously, Sheila had sent me a news article about a small coffee shop close to where she had lived once upon a time. And Sheila is one of the ones who helped me with the Indrid Cold episode for the Uncomfortable podcast. Now, she just basically sent me this little article about this cute little coffee shop. And apparently she hadn't read it. She just kind of saw the article, was like, oh, that was close to where I lived once, and just sent it over to me as just kind of like, look, this is cute. Well, I actually read the article, and I discovered that there was a man named Buck Nelson who had a similar encounter as Woody with some friendly visitors. Now, Buck ended up writing a book called My Trip to Mars, the Moon, and Venus. Very important that you listen to that. Mars, Moon, and Venus. Because when I went online in order to find the book, the updated copies that have annotations by different people, they removed the name Venus and changed it to Planet A, because they felt that Venus ruined the experience because of scientific discoveries showing that Venus is uninhabitable, and therefore renamed what Buck originally had said. I want to take everyone at face value. I am not going to rename what Buck had originally said, and I am going to keep everything as Venus. Now, Buck's story in reading his book is quite interesting, and I am going to go into this in depth because I find it really, really important with the correlations. And I promise once I get further into this, everything will start to make sense. But for now, just strap in, it's JJ story time. Okay, so Buck Nelson had pretty much done everything as a job most of his life. He traveled all over. He loved his home in the Ozark Mountains of Michigan. And when he got old enough and saved enough up and was done running around the country, he decided he would settle in there on his farm and live out his days in retirement bliss. Unfortunately, because he had worked a ton of labor jobs on railroads and all sorts of stuff, he had worn his body down, and he suffered from a condition called lumbago, and in his back, which is kind of like almost like spinal stenosis or lower back pain, but pretty severe, and neuritis in his side and in his arm. So basically imagine that this man is around 58 years old, and he's got severe lower back pain and severe inflammation of the nerves in his side and in his arm. So he's not super mobile. He is not farming. He's basically retiring. He's, living out his days, enjoying nature and pretty much cooking and cleaning for himself just a little bit, but he's not running around. He's not doing huge, big things. Buck Nelson was 59 years old when this encounter took place. So he's not really old. Like, his body just has gone through some things, right? So he's not super mobile, but he's not old. So on July 30th of 1954, mind you, this is 12 years before Woody's encounter, okay? So 12 years before Mothman Prophecies, Woody Derenberger, any talk of Indrid Cold. 12 years before, in the middle of nowhere, Michigan, in the Ozark Mountains, Buck is sitting in his home listening to his radio with his dog. He says it's around 4 p.m. I have questions on the time frame, and you'll see why in a minute. But basically he's sitting there, and the radio starts to go wild. And as the radio is making all these weird sounds, and then all of a sudden the dog starts freaking out, and then his pony outside starts freaking out. So Buck at this point is like, what is going on? And gets up and goes outside to go see what all the ruckus is. And as he steps outside, overhead his home and in his yard was a giant flying saucer. And higher up from this big one over his home that was lower were two other ones. Buck was smart because immediately Buck was like, I'm going to grab a picture. He runs back inside, grabs his camera, comes out, takes 3 pictures. According to Buck, only 2 pictures actually came out, and they basically look like fireballs. When Buck went into the house to grab the camera, for whatever reason, he grabbed a flashlight as well. Now, this is why I'm questioning the 4 p.m. because middle of summer, 4 p.m., it's still pretty light outside. Why would you grab a flashlight? But I don't know. I've never been to the Ozark Mountains, so maybe it gets dark there. I don't know. For whatever reason, he takes these pictures and then he starts waving the flashlight at the saucers. Instead of the saucers landing, the larger craft basically shot this beam of light that enveloped Buck, and he described it as hotter and brighter than the sun. It lasted a few seconds. It ended up causing Buck to fall down once the beam of light stopped. And, again, this is a man with severe back pain and nerve pain. So, he's thinking in his mind, great, now I've fallen over and now I've got to get up. And that's going to be a process, right? Especially when you have back pain. So he's expecting this normal, painful struggle, and yet he's shocked because he goes to get up and he has no pain. Like none. Like completely new body, almost. And on top of that, he used to need glasses here and there, and especially for reading, and now he no longer needed glasses. So Buck has just seen a giant spaceship plus 2 other ones. They beam down this light. He gets pictures, and then all of a sudden his body's healed. So Buck is having a moment, okay? But Buck is a very sweet, simple man. He kind of just talks to his neighbor about it a little bit. It's like, wow, that was wild. But other than that, he just lives his life, enjoying the no back pain. So the second encounter happens about 5 months later on February 1st in 1955. And this is at noon. So midday, Buck sees the craft circle over his house, and somehow the craft asked him if he was friendly or not. Now, in Buck's mind, he thought that this was a public address system. Like, I think it's telepathy. But for whatever reason, Buck thought it was like they were beaming it down with a speaker or something. And Buck basically is like, yeah, I'm friendly. Thanks for healing my back. And they then ask, hey, can we land in your yard beyond the pasture where there's a water spring? And Buck's like, oh, okay, sure. And then they said, but can we land there every once in a while without being bothered? And then Buck said, yes, that's fine. I'll leave you alone. Like, I get it. And then they left by saying, we'll see you again. Sound familiar? If any of you know anything about the Woody Derenberger and Indrid Cold, whenever Indrid would leave, he would never say goodbye. He would always say, I'll see you soon, or we'll see you again. Interesting. Interesting little caveats that blend into the other. But, it's a saying. People say things like that when they leave, so let's not read too much into it just yet. A month later, on March 5th, 1955, 3 men and a huge dog, come up to the house around midnight. Oh, you gotta remember, guys, this is the Ozark Mountains. February 1st is winter. It's cold. You got some random strangers coming up to your house in the middle of the night, waking you up. And apparently, Buck Nelson just recognizes that these men are these aliens from this spacecraft that have popped up twice now. So he's told that one of the men is actually from Earth. He was a human from Earth, and that had gone with these space beings to their planet to live with them. And his name was Little Buck or Bucky. So here we have a case where we have a human traveling with these beings, and the human made the choice to go live with them and travel all around to different planets. And, now he's stopping off at Earth in another man named Buck's yard. It ends up turning out later in the story that Little Bucky is actually Buck Nelson's distant cousin. They look similar. Apparently, Little Bucky was taken when he was 4 years old. His parents didn't want to go, but they agreed to let Little Bucky go. Which also is interesting when you think about, abductions and certain things of like the parents were like, no, we'll stay, but like go ahead and take our kid. Well, think of the average parent who would be completely cool with that, but okay, that's a little side note there. So one man was named Bob Solomon. I think that's how I pronounce it. Solomon. So I'm just going to go with Solomon. It's so fun when I'm reading these in my head and everything is fluid, and then I go to say it out loud and stumbling all over myself. But I digress. Bob Solomon looked about 19 years old, even though Bob Solomon was an alien and was 200 years old. There was a third man who was wrinkly, didn't give his name, but he was introduced as a trainee who was learning to drive the ship. So these three guys and this giant dog come into Buck's home, and again, middle of the night, right? Like this is midnight, and he's letting these strangers in, and they're kind of rummaging around his house, looking at everything with almost fascination in a way. Not like they've never seen it before, but imagine like if we were to walk into a vintage antique shop where we kind of get excited, like, oh, I've heard of this Victrola, but I've never seen one up close. Almost that kind of vibe. And a lot of the items, Buck Nelson would ask them, do you have this? Like, do you even know what this is? And they're like, oh yeah, we have this. Ours are just easier to work. Like, basically your stuff is really outdated. And they stated that their beds were built into the wall, so there was no dust under them, like we all have. And they do not have bedding. Instead, when the bed comes down from the wall, they have a canopy that comes down for privacy and comfort, and a dial that they can set for further comfort. Even the pillow is built into the mattress. So way different than what we're doing in the 1950s, right? Just a flat mattress and you put some pillows and a whole bunch of sheets and comforters and stuff on it. And apparently everything for them is way different. And again, this is 1955. Like, the average person has not seen or even thought about technology or devices, some of which I'm going to be describing because I thought it was fascinating. So they wanted to know about the radio that Buck Nelson had and the battery atop it. And Buck was saying, well, yeah, you could plug it in, or, it plugs into this battery. And they made an interesting comment. With all this power overhead, you use that battery? And then they shook their heads in confusion. And, Buck is, again, confused. And so Buck's asking, like, well, what do you guys do? And they're like, well, we plug our lights and appliances into our quote-unquote radio for power. Which, dialing it back, again, I'm dealing with a man from the mid-1950s. He only had a 6th grade education, so Buck Nelson is not, the most read and learned man there ever was. He did a lot of labor jobs. He was not working in colleges and things like that. He lived in the Ozark Mountains for years. So he's been very sheltered from technology and kind of what's going on in the bigger cities. And so when he's hearing them say they plug their lights and appliances into their quote-unquote radio for power, that's his interpretation. I am seeing it more as they were able to channel power almost like how we use Wi-Fi, right? So here's some interesting stuff that ends up happening. This all is interesting, but here's another curious one. So Buck Nelson has a picture of Jesus Christ on the wall and a couple other Christian pictures. And Buck basically asked these beings, does this mean anything to you? And they replied, I'm going to say this verbatim, yes, we understand, but you people don't. And then they explained to Buck that Earth people have an entire misconception of it all. I agree with these people. Basically, they offered Buck a ride if he wants to go to some other planets, if and only if they would tell people about them visiting. Again, sound familiar? This is what Indrid does with Woody Derenberger. Tells Woody, I will come back and visit you and we can chat more, but only if you go to the authorities and tell them that we visited. And, obviously, in both Woody and Buck's case, you start telling people that you had aliens and spaceships land in your yard in the 50s and 60s, and you're going to become the laughingstock, right? You could ruin your reputation extremely quickly back in those days. But both men held such strong conviction about what they experienced that they did it. So a few weeks later, these beings come back and they ready Buck for his trip. And they also clear out the 3 water springs on the far side of Buck's property. Now, please remember the fresh water. This is going to be an interesting little theme that's going to come through this. And while they were when they cleared out the springs, they placed 12 stones in a circle. And Buck asked them why, and they said it was to represent the 12 laws of God, which are their laws. And Buck, before he goes on the spaceship, grabs some paper and takes down these 12 laws verbatim. And I am actually going to read them to you verbatim from what Buck had written down. The 12 laws. Number 1, love your maker, God. Number 2, thou shalt not kill, including accidents and war. Number 3, love your neighbor. Number 4, let your light shine before men, and all will see your good works, and it will be an honor to you and your Maker, God. 5, thou shalt not commit adultery. 6, thou shalt not steal. 7, thou must do as thou wish to be done by. So the golden rule, in essence. Number 8, no other gods shall be before thee. Number 9, do not take the name of God in vain. Number 10, honor thy mother and the father. 11, your body is God's. Do not misuse it in any way. Do not drink nor eat anything that is not food. Use nothing to harm the body, either inside or out. Wear nothing on the body that harms it, or it is of no use. 12, God made the heaven and the earth, and we must give him thanks for what he gives us. That sounds mighty familiar to a lot of our 10 commandments. There's just a few in there that are a little bit different. So Buck ends up going on a few space rides to the moon, the Mars, and Venus. He could not bring anything in his pockets. He was told that it would be magnetized if he did. And Buck was gone a total of 3 days and 2 nights. Kind of interesting. So for Buck, the first planet, the exterior of the homes looked like rock with metal inside. They went there, they ate food, Buck was taken around, people that looked just like him. He was told that there were other races of people on that planet, but they would keep him to meeting those that looked like him, i.e. those he was familiar with, what they looked like. I found that interesting. When he was taken to the moon, he was told that the moon was used as a base. There were clusters of homes near giant hangars for the spacecraft. They ate, and Buck slept on the craft in between visiting the planets. So there was a bit of time that elapsed, unlike Woody, which is like 15 minutes, and then he's supposedly on this other planet. So the third place that they go to is Venus. And Buck describes that the homes again were rock exterior with steel interiors. People wore overalls without clasps and different materials than our clothing. There were cars that had no fenders nor wheels. They hovered above the ground. And Buck said the cars looked a lot like new cars of his time. So again, mid-1950s. Which I find interesting because I want you to keep this in mind. There's a lot of Men in Black reports that state that these cars that show up, that these, Men in Black get out of, look pristine and they look like they are from the 50s or 60s. Like, they look like older cars that we had in the 50s and 60s, but like pristine, and they're usually black. And that's interesting because, well, you will see, even Christopher Bledsoe, who is a modern day Woody and Buck, he also had one of these black cars from the 50s or 60s turn into his driveway and leave no tire marks. Okay, I digress. So Buck, is kind of getting used to these different planets and their cultures, and he's asking tons of questions. And he's told that people work about an hour a day. That's it. They build things that last forever. So they have a lot of leisure time, right? Like, if you build something that lasts forever, you're not constantly having to manufacture more stuff. Buck was showed a machine in which you could put a book and it would read it to you out loud. Or you could ask it and it would play music and it showed pictures. Now again, this is 1955, and Buck is basically describing a modern day, Google, Alexa, Siri, whatever device that we have now. Fascinating. Or even computers. Buck had stated on all planets, people ate very pure and very healthy. Disease is rare and people are good looking, more so than the people of Earth. I find this interesting because even in Woody's account with Indrid Cold, he said Indrid Cold had very striking features. And when I went back to go see through Woody's eyes what Indrid looked like, he looked like a conglomeration of Clark Gable and Gomez from the original Addams Family. Very striking, prominent features, very good looking, just interesting. He said that the people of those planets all use natural medicines. They use hypnosis for pain control, never for play. So only for pain control. They disagree with hypnosis being used for anything else. They do not play competitive sports because of the wear and tear on the body. And in Buck's experience, all beings spoke English. He was told that they deliberately learn the language of the people they will be contacting, i.e. English is not their native tongue, but because they were going to come to America and pick up Buck, they decided to learn English. And that's interesting. Buck feels that we should work with them and that they can help make our planet better. But they state clearly to Buck that they cannot interfere with us unless they are asked for help via the Galactic Council. Exactly what Indrid Cold stated existed. Buck did say that he was told that if we had a major planetary catastrophe, like a great flood, that they would come and help the survivors. If you have watched the show Encounters on Netflix, the very last one regarding the Fukushima incident in Japan with the great earthquake, there is a part where, the radiation is just, it's bad. It's really, really bad. And even the people going in to go find out what the readings were basically knew it was a death sentence. And they end up seeing these 3 crafts hover above, and shortly thereafter they go back in to go take another reading, and it had fallen like 600 points or 600%. Don't quote me on that, but there was a 600 in there somewhere. So that's kind of interesting when Buck's saying that they can't directly intervene unless they're asked to, but if there's a major planetary catastrophe, they can come and at least help, which apparently occurred with the Fukushima event. So Buck obviously asked the question, like, hey, why me? And one of the things they responded with is that they've taken many people on rides, including some of our government folks. Obviously, those government folks weren't about to admit that, but Buck stated that he knew for a fact there were other people who had been taken up. not only in the way that these people on these other planets had received him, but also because there were certain things that they knew that you would really have to get from talking to other people like us, humans. Buck stated that they land where they do based on magnetic lines that are within the Earth. That those are kind of like their signal landing pad trail, if you will. And one thing that they said that I found interesting, there are many of them among us on Earth. Okay. Interesting. So, after this experience, Buck is telling other people, and specifically his neighbor, he's definitely talking to her. And she, luckily, she can read, write, and type and do all the things. So she's taking copious notes. And shortly after these experiences, and Buck gets to talk at a couple conferences, he's actually approached by, Buck doesn't say it, but let's just face it, these were obviously someone in some official capacity, and they offered him $1,000 if he would never tell his story again. Now, you got to remember, this man lives in the Ozark Mountains. He lives a pretty simple life. That would be equivalent to about $11,000 now. If you went to a similar place that was, a very depressed area, person wasn't working, they didn't really have like a ton of income, $11,000 could really turn your life around. And Buck said no. He said, no, it is more important to me to stick to my values and talk about these people because these people were great. And why aren't we talking about them? Why aren't we working with them? Like, hello, we could use them. So as Buck is speaking at a few more conventions, he actually ends up seeing a couple representatives from the different planets in the crowds. So again, we come back to there's something different about these people in which you can tell they're not from here. But they're not so ostentatious looking that you would think, oh, that's not a human. Because in both instances, both in Woody's with Indrid Cold and both with Buck with this Bob Solomon, they're not scared. These people don't look wildly different than us, but there's something about them that people are able to obviously pick out or think that they're a little peculiar and somehow know. And basically, Buck just likes telling his story, and he stated, sharing my story and my experience with them was our agreement from the get-go, and they healed me, and I'm going to continue telling my story. And as much ridicule as he underwent as a result, he never faltered. I mean, in reality, he really was a proponent of we should be working with these people. And also, like Woody, later in time, Buck is approached by a few astronomers, scientists, and people from the Army. They not only questioned Buck about his experience, but they actually came out to his home to take measurements and readings and all sorts of stuff. So once again, just like Woody Derenberger, we have someone who is taken seriously in his accounts. And, Woody got taken to NASA and questioned by a ton of government folks after he started opening up about his encounters with Indrid. So it shows that, someone had their eye on this and was taking Buck seriously. There was enough there that they were taking it somewhat seriously. Whether they were going to report that to everyone else or not is a whole different, but Buck was making the rounds. He was not doing huge conventions. These were much smaller back in those days. These would be groups of like-minded people. It wasn't like conventions of our time where you get thousands of people packed into an auditorium. These are like at someone's house or at like a little Moose Lodge hall, something like that, right? Where he's talking to anywhere, between 10 to maybe 50 people. So him being able to pick out of the crowd someone from one of these planets Or even maybe he wasn't able to pick them out and they just come up to him afterwards and are able to give him enough information that he knows indeed they are, is interesting. And it also means that these beings are able to blend in with other humans and only be noticed by those that really know them. So remember, we've got little Bucky, who was the 4-year-old who had grown up on these other planets. His parents let him go with the aliens. So around Christmas time, about a year after all these events happened, little Bucky returns to hang out with Buck for Christmas. And Buck asks him, hey, I've been talking to my neighbor about all this and other people and doing what you guys told me, but would you be okay recording something for me? Like a message? And little Bucky says, sure. And the resounding message is, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the resounding message is, give up atomic weapons and warfare. Stop keeping the space friends a secret and work together to make the world a better place. Very, very, very interesting. Because if you think about the times that we're in now, it kind of seems to be the same resounding message as well. Now, Buck was given some information regarding Atlantis. And I want you to please be mindful. If you don't know much about Atlantis, that's absolutely fine. If you would like to immerse yourself a little bit more, I'm sure there's podcasts who do an amazing job at talking about it. But the source that I would definitely recommend that you read is the book by Edgar Cayce on Atlantis. I want to note that that book was published in 1988, but it was actually dictated by Edgar Cayce in the mid-1930s to 1940s. So this is a long, this is 15 years at least before Buck Nelson is having this experience. And the book wasn't even out until 88, which means unless you were aware of Edgar Cayce's work and knew someone who knew these transcripts, no one knew this information. But the correlations between the two are quite interesting. So I'm just going to read the excerpt regarding Atlantis that Buck was given. Atlantis was a godly nation, largest of the known continents on Earth. They became wise, strong, and learned. But, forgetting God, they wanted more power to provide more leisure, time, pleasure. They had not been a warlike nation. They learned of power even greater than our atomic power. They had great, long, large tunnels under their largest city. They were used for research work and experimentation with new power they were developing. In these experiments, this new power was let loose and Atlantis was destroyed. According to the Alliance TerraCore website, Atlantis was destroyed at War's End. It was into the ocean. This was our biblical flood. All known lands at that time were flooded as tidal waves were caused. North America rised up out of the ocean. This continent had space travel and exchanged goods with other planets. Some people of Atlantis escaped death and were taken to Mars and then eventually moved to permanently living on ships. Venus has a record of Atlantis going down. It is said that perhaps some were washed ashore to the new North America. They would degenerate because of living in caves, eating fish and seaweed. Perhaps these people were our civilization after the flood. Then these people vanished from the earth, leaving behind many cliff dwellings and evidence of former civilization. Bucky tells me of the planets of Venus and Mars have seen this earth populated many times only to disappear. It was populated at the last time by many planets who sent their undesirable people here to work out their own problems. Again, that's an excerpt from the book My Trip to Mars, the Moon, and Planet A, or Planet Venus, by Buck Nelson. You can get it on Amazon. It was about $4. And it is a very large book, kind of like the size of a coloring book, by the way. Not that many pages, just big type. So if you need glasses normally, you definitely won't for this. So why am I bringing all this up, and why am I going to keep prattling on about even more? Well, in the Bible, there are many visitations of these beings coming down. And again, they look human enough, but there's something about them that people know they're not humans. And they were called angels. So in the story about Sodom and Gomorrah, there's two silver-clothed beings that were called angels. They come, they eat, they sleep, they talk with Lot. And people knew they were different. Again, even though they looked like humans. And yes, their dress was different than the dress of the time. But that alone wouldn't set off the people kind of clamoring for them the way that was described. There are numerous other visitations in the Bible about these beings showing up, and somehow people knew, or eventually knew, they were not human, even though they looked as such. Sometimes they brought gifts or messages, and other times they brought warnings. There's even an account with Abraham where angels, quote unquote, showed up, and he didn't recognize them as first as angels. He just thought they were people, like, go away, and then suddenly realized who they were. Well, our next person, who is much more recent, still alive, still with us, and very, very active, is Mr. Christopher Bledsoe. He's still encountering these orbs and having communication with these beings. His is a little bit different, but I do consider him our modern day Buck Nelson and Woody Derenberger. Now, Chris, much like Buck Nelson and Woody Derenberger, was a very religious man. Now, Christopher Bledsoe was an evangelical Christian, and they are a very, very strict denomination. It's very devout. It's very restricted in their beliefs. Anything outside of the Bible and what they're taught is completely restricted. Most times they don't really even hang out with people who are of different religions than they are. They kind of keep to themselves. So when I say it's very devout and restrictive, it is. So this man has like this, very devout life and belief system, and then ends up getting to this very low point in his life due to a whole bunch of different factors. You can read his book, UFO of God, if you would like to get into more. I have read it, definitely recommend, but you definitely see, just like Woody, all the stuff this man goes through in order just to tell his story and to get to the point where he has contact with these beings. It's very interesting. So Mr. Bledsoe basically is at this really low point in his life and kind of cries out for help and has this incredible experience with these beings and missing time, the whole shebang-a-bang, and even his older son was a witness. And so, what does he want to do? He wants to go back and he wants to tell his community he's supposed to love and support him, especially if you pay attention to what Jesus said in the actual Bible. But instead, he's pretty much ousted from his own community as a heretic. All because he comes back knowing that other beings besides us exist, and knowing that love all is what's right and what is good. His entire life gets turned upside down by this experience. And yet, through all of the bad times, and his whole family ends up going through it. It's not just him. No one ever suffers alone, right? Especially if you're within a family, someone goes through something and everyone's going through it. But he ends up getting talked to by government officials. He gets a private tour of NASA, just like Woody. He gets to see a rocket launch, just like Woody. He's interviewed umpteen times. He's asked very specifically about how this experience changed his belief system. Same thing with Woody and also with Buck. And then, of course, we have him bringing people to actually see the phenomenon at his property. So he really is the modern day Woody Derenberger, because Woody Derenberger was also bringing people. He had hordes of people come to his property and have little meetings at his home. And then all of a sudden these spaceships would just start whizzing by and doing flybys. And just like Christopher Bledsoe has these orbs that he's able to see. And if you follow him on social media, he puts a ton of his videos out if you're interested. The difference with Christopher Bledsoe and Woody and Buck is that Christopher Bledsoe saw a female speak to him instead of a man. And it also happened more kind of like during his missing time. So he had missing time, bits and pieces of that missing time started coming back to him over time, but then he did a regression hypnosis session, and it ends up he was pretty much talking to Hathor, the Egyptian goddess. He calls her the lady, and if you want to hear more on that, I definitely recommend listening to the transcript of his entire hypnosis experience with the lady on episode 17 of his son's podcast called Bledsoe Says So. You can get that on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. It's a pretty popular one. I've actually been listening to it. There were definitely some huge things that stuck out to me of just the synchronicities and things also that have been happening to me. So, you want to talk about a very Christian man suddenly seeing an Egyptian goddess, right? A little weird, but not so much for me. So, basically on Halloween, I don't normally plan my costumes out in advance. I mean, I try to, but they pretty much end up being whatever they're going to be. So the day of Halloween, I still had absolutely nothing planned. And I just said, okay, Spirit, guide me. What am I going to be? And I start putting this blue makeup on my face. And all of a sudden I'm doing this weird eyeliner. And then I'm putting on these star decals on my face. And I get done and I look at myself and I'm like, what am I? Right? And I basically asked, my Alexa and described what I looked like. And it said that was the Egyptian goddess Nut. And so if you know about the Egyptian goddess Nut, she's the one who stands, basically she arches, her hands and feet are all over the earth and protects the night sky, protects Earth, right? The sky of Earth at night. And not nighttime per se, but like protects the skies. I need you guys to just think about this with me. Work with me, people. I know you know where I'm going. You can look her up. Her name is actually spelled Nut, N-U-T, but it's pronounced Newt. So, normally I looked her up, thought, okay, gave homage, thank you. Really wasn't completely clear why this was coming up and why I was dressed like this, but, it's Halloween. We're doing it. So about a week ago, I was doing a meditation. And in this meditation, it's not guided, right? I'm just kind of listening to music and zoning out and seeing what comes through. And immediately I'm taken, and I don't visually see anything, but I hear this voice. And the only way to describe it is, it's not like I hear it in my head or with my ears. It's like I heard it with my whole body. And I heard her say, I am Nut, Mother Goddess. And then I basically went, I'm sorry, what? And then she repeated it again. And then one more time. And then after that, my meditation just went on. And there were a couple other things that I saw, but they weren't really relevant. So I thought that was interesting. And we're definitely coming into the time of the divine feminine. And let's face it, we could definitely use some feminine energy in the world right now because things are pretty gnarly and heated up right now. And everyone just needs to calm down, take a little nappy nap, and eat a sandwich. And we'll all get along much better. I digress. All three of the men that I have described, Woodrow Derenberger, Buck Nelson, Christopher Bledsoe, they're all very simple, God-fearing men who really didn't believe in much else besides what was in front of them and providing for their families. And by saying simple, I don't mean they're dumb. Everyone is a complex individual. But what I mean is they're not, highly well-read, right? They're not college professors. They're not going into ancient philosophies. They attend church. They believe very simply and devoutly. if you've ever met someone who has just a very simple faith, they're almost uncomplex in how beautiful their faith is. That, they don't need to sit there and give you a 58-point diagram as to why they believe. They just believe, and there's this steadfastness. And one of my dear friends has this, and it's absolutely beautiful. And she's, for the most part, pretty quiet, very sincere, very beautiful internally and externally. But I would almost call her much like them. Just a very simple, God-fearing, devout, beautiful person. And again, not to say they're not complex in all the ways that all of ourselves are complex. They're just a little more like meat and potatoes. And each of them all had an ailment that was healed or presented as a result of their experience with these beings. And all of them were asked to tell others about the experience. And again, 55, 66, even in the mid 2000s or 2003, I think is when Christopher Bledsoe first had his first encounter. These were not fun times to come out and just start saying, you had an experience with an alien. This really, really, really put you in quite a situation. So all of these people had their lives completely in shambles, and in some cases, major upheavals. Woody Derenberger ended up getting a divorce and having to move, and, ended up living a rather strange life, kind of going on the convention circuit. Buck, really don't know what happened to Buck, but I assume Buck lived the rest of his life out just talking about this and simply in his Ozark Mountain home. And we have Christopher Bledsoe, who just wrote a book, UFO of God, and he's doing tons of interviews, and he's been on TV shows, and his son has the podcast, Bledsoe Says So, which he's really talking about his dad's encounters and unpacking the deeper meanings of what these mean. And that's important because now it's not just affecting the person who had the experience, it's affecting the rest of the familial unit, as well as so many millions and thousands of other people, depending on what time. All right, so we have these experiences, and you're thinking, okay, and then? Well, there's some other cases that I wanted to bring up because they fit into these friendly visitors, and they manifest in many, many different ways. So this next case is Joe Simonton, and this happened April of 1961. Joe's basically in his home. He hears a strange noise outside, and he goes outside to take a look, see what it is, sees a flying saucer has landed, and two men get out that he said looked Italian, meaning probably that they had darker features. And instead of speaking, they basically gesture to him with their hands, and they show him a jug, like, can we get some water? So he takes the jug, fills it up with water, and gives it to them. And then they basically have this flameless grill, and they have these little cake things on them, and they give him 3 of these cakes. Okay, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China, right? Okay, so now we have a man who has this very, very abrupt, kind of no-nonsense, they just stopped by for some water, alien beings in a flying saucer asking him for water. They give him these 3 cakes. And Joe was smart, because even though Joe is a rather simple man, Joe was like, I gotta tell somebody about this. And he, of course, tried eating one of the cakes, and he said it tasted like cardboard. So he ends up sending the cakes in for samples to find out what are they composed of. And the sample comes back, and it's made of a whole bunch of whole grains. But the one thing it was missing was sodium, aka salt. Now, here's the thing. Everything on planet Earth contains salt. It's because we have vast oceans and seas. It's in our air, it's in the particulates, it's therefore in every living thing on the planet, including all plant life. So there is absolutely no way that we are capable of making something without any trace detection of salt. And these were scientifically, I mean, these went to a lab, and this is on file. And again, that's Joe Simonton, Simon, T-O-N at the end. And that was in April of 1961. So what's interesting is, again, these beings wore similar attire, something as described as coveralls without any buttons or clasps, kind of silverish, like a weird or black material that's weird looking, like something these people have never seen before in this time. And they all want fresh water. I know I brought that up a few times. So stick with me, folks. This is going to be a fun, wild ride. There is lore about the gentry, or the good fellows, aka Fae, that they do not eat salt and they only eat pure food and fresh water. We have a case in Ireland during the time of famine in which Mr. Pat Feeney, who was hit, he had done very well for himself, but when the famine hit, much like most people, financially, he took a spiral of a downturn. Now, one day, he's really low on food. A little woman came to him and asked for some oatmeal. Knowing never to be rude to a stranger, and him having guilt for being so low on food himself, but wanting to help her, he offered her a bag of potatoes instead, because he had more potatoes than he did oatmeal. She insisted on oatmeal, and then he said, okay, and he gave her a bag of the last of his oats. She asked him to leave the bag in his pantry, and she would come back and fetch it. Okay, that was kind of normal at the time, right? Well, the next day, he goes out to his pantry, and it's so full of oats, it's overflowing. And this is what people of that time called the gentry, or the good folk, or good fellows, or the Fae. Now, Paracelsus wrote a book on these peoples. In particular, one story from August of 1491, okay? 1491. This is a good long while ago. From the father of Jerome Cardon. His name was Faustus Cardon, and around 8 p.m. in, again, 1400s, okay? Like, this is some time ago. Around 8 p.m., Faustus is outside. 7 men appeared wearing silken garments that resembled Greek togas, but they had shiny shoes, unlike he had never seen before. Their undergarments were beautifully covered, completely not something anyone was wearing or was in fashion of the time. When Faustus asked who they replied that they were men composed of air and subject to birth and death. They lived longer than us, up to 300 years. For whatever reason, they get into this really deep conversation, and Faustus asks them about the immortality of the soul, and they affirm that nothing survives that which is peculiar to the individual. Odd answer, but we like it. Apparently, he asked them why they do not share treasures with men, and they were told that they could not under severe penalty of law. Now, the average person reading that is going to think treasures, meaning why you have shiny shoes, or show us where the gold is, or this or that. But what he meant by treasures was their way of life, how to live like them. And they were told that they could not under severe penalty of law. So here we go back to this galactic council type of thing that Woody was told about, as was Buck. When Faustus asked them about God, they disagreed with the notion of God making the world from eternity, and instead said that God made the world moment by moment, and should he desist for an instant, all should perish. So here we have an account from 800 years ago in which these beings appeared, shared some wisdom, were told that they could not tell all of mankind all that they knew according to this law that they were under. And at this time in history, there had to be a reason why, which obviously seems like it's lessened more of today. And I think part of that is because we have the atom bomb and nuclear capability. Right? So, but again, even back then when they were asked like, hey, why can't you intervene and like help us out down here? Because, we're struggling. And they're basically told like, we can't according to our laws. Now, the part about them saying God creates everything in a moment. There's a movie called Alien Code, and I think it came out in 2014. And I know I've talked about it before a few times, but there's an ending scene where he and this being are kind of in this cube box type thing. And they're talking. And the being is basically telling them, we don't experience time like you. We experience everything all in one moment. And that's always really stuck out to me because I find it extremely important. There's a lot of Easter eggs and gems in that movie. Is it the best movie you've ever watched in your life? No, but it has some really, really, really deep themes in that movie. So, highly recommend. It's free, probably streaming somewhere. I digress. So, in the early 800s, yes, okay, 800 AD, or whatever epoch of time we're living in right now, there was a case documented by Agobard, who was the Archbishop of Lyons in France, in which 4 people were returned from, and I quote, ships in the sky coming from a place called Magonia. These 4 people were interrogated by the locals and then stoned to death because no one would believe their tales. And there is a book called Passport to Magonia by Jacque Vallee. Highly recommend it. I am currently reading it. I'm about a third of the way through. This book is kind of like John Keel's The Eighth Tower and Mothman Prophecies, but like on steroids and a lot more European reports. So I am definitely loving it. If you want to get on board, it was a little pricey. It was about $28 for the book off of Amazon. But I think it's because, it was written back in the 60s, and so they just basically print it brand new. All used copies were like $80. So, and interestingly enough, if you had listened to David Grush being interviewed on Joe Rogan, which I definitely hope you have listened to that interview by now, David Grush actually mentions this book, which is hilarious because his book keeps getting mentioned to me before even that interview. So I ordered it, and then the day it arrived is the day that Grush had his interview with Rogan and mentioned it, and I just howled a little bit at the universe putting me in the right place at the right time, because it loves to do that, and I appreciate it. So we have many and multiple reports of humans flying through the air during the day or the night, right, over time. And back in the day, they were called witches. Because remember the whole thing, witches rode on brooms through the sky, because, we all just have to get somewhere quick. Sorry, a little witch humor for you. The Catholic Church has a ton of these accounts in their archives. I mean, a ton. And perhaps these weren't just old hags on brooms, as current folklore will have us believe, but rather something unexplainable with words from that time that have converted into this belief. Because again, you have to think, back in those times, they didn't have the word spaceship. So they would just say a person flying through the air. And then someone would be like, well, what were they flying on? And, how do you describe a spaceship, right? Or how do you describe however they were doing this? So again, when you have something being translated from hundreds or thousands of years ago, there weren't necessarily the words that we have to now. So you really have to think through what it is that they're stating. The entirety of the Hindu books are filled with stories of flying chariots and cities that flew through the air by gods who had blue skin. They looked like human, but they were just a little different, and so they were considered gods, right? Ancient Japanese and Chinese cultures, too, have flying chariots, and they tell of people who flew down on dragons, as did the Mayans and the Aztecs, the Incas. I mean, all of these old generations and cultures had talks about these things, and yet we're going to sit here and say they're not true. Those are all just legends and lore, right? And so trying not to get heated. Anywho, so even the Mayans had stories of flying fireballs, of which creatures would come out of them. They also had things that were called icals, which were described as a small people with black skin who flew in these fireballs. And they would actually war with the people if they were provoked. If they landed and they did their thing, cool. Like, they didn't bother anybody. But, you know, of course, the Mayans in the beginning were pretty territorial, so anything flying down, they're going to go look at it, and they wanted to stab it. And so the Mayans basically learned really, really quick they didn't stand a chance because these things had some sort of technology. They actually, they all had similar technology, which was this thing that they would hold in their hand and point at you, and it would cause you to freeze. And I don't mean like get cold. I mean like you couldn't move. Almost like a stun gun, right? I don't even know if that's a real thing. But there's so many stories of entities having this thing that literally freezes people in place. And they're cognizant. They're able to think. They're recording in their mind what's going on, but they're not able to move or speak or do anything. And then when these things leave or when they're about to leave, then they unfreeze the people and then they can go about their business. The Paiute clan of California had stories of silver flying canoes. Okay, again, they don't have the word spaceship, but they're saying silver flying canoes. Spaceship. They also, in their legends, said that California was once inhabited by a superior race of beings called the Hov-Masals, which had a technology that would allow them to fly through the air like eagles, as well as a device that, if pointed at you, would stun you to freeze in place. The Celtic people have numerous stories about the Fae folk, including dwarves or Awisks, and their king tracked them down once and went to their kingdom. So this is a really, really old story, and I actually don't know what time frame it's from, but like I want to say like old. So basically there's this Celtic king who's kind of annoyed because the dwarves and Eswisks and Fae folk, they had all sorts of different names for them, and some of them there's absolutely no way that I'm going to even attempt to pronounce these names. But elven type Fae folk. And this king, I don't know, he gets a burn his bonnet about something, and basically he ends up following them and finds his way into their kingdom. And he ends up kind of in this big room with them, and they end up locking him in the room, and then they all turn around and they just grin at him. And so he challenges them, and he's like, hey, you know, like, why are you all grinning at me? And they basically look at him and they said, well, we've only had one other man ever make it to our kingdom before. And he took off terrified before we were even able to have a conversation. So again, these are flesh and blood beings who look like us, but are slightly different in some capacity. In this case, they were shorter. Some of them are described as being black, meaning like their skin is black or they're coated in fur. Or they have features that in some way humans know they're not us. And in order to get to their kingdom or wherever they live, you have to follow them and go through like kind of a journey, which, you know, goes into a lot of Fae lore where you don't want to go to where they go because time moves differently there. There's another Irish legend in which these beings actually fought with the people and provided them air support via, quote unquote, flying chariots. That story in particular harkens back to 1014. So again, here we have another language barrier. They don't have the word spaceship, so they call them flying chariots. Well, and they're helping them actually win a war against another warring people. Just, I'm just saying. There's a lot. In the mid-1600s, Reverend Kirk of Aberfoyle studied the theology and writings predating him and came up with a list of characteristics of elves and aerial beings. Again, aerial beings. They knew that there was a race of people who were able to live in the sky. And they weren't birds. These were people. And again, this is the mid-1600s. There's a lack of technology and there's a lack of verbiage of what these people are trying to describe. So I wanted to bring out some salient points from this particular book because it kind of blew my mind. For anyone who's like, oh, UFOs are brand new. No. Listen to this. Physically, they have a very light and fluid bodies, which are comparable to a cloud. They're particularly visible at night, and they can appear and vanish at will. That sounds like a UFO, doesn't it? Intellectually, the beings are intelligent and curious. Every single report that I read so far has been them, poking around, asking questions. And they're very, very smart. The book states that they have the power to carry away anything they like. So, beaming up a cow or a house or a bunch of people, whatever. When men did not inhabit all of the earth, meaning we weren't spread out everywhere, they too lived here, having their own agriculture, civilizations, and buildings, of which remnants have been left for us to see. So we have things like Stonehenge and the pyramids and all sorts of other weird things that we don't really understand who built these or why they had them. Well, it's because they were living here with us. Another description in this book is their chameleon-like bodies allow them to swim through the air with their whole house. Again, spaceship. Like your whole house is swimming through the air. Chameleon-like bodies, meaning they're able to change their color and fade in and out and be visible or not visible. Their houses are incredibly large, but for the most part invisible to human eyes. Again, their houses fly. So, yeah. Their homes are equipped with lamps that need no oil and never burn out. These are lights. These are explaining like UFO lights in the 1600s. It's also said that they speak very little, probably because they use telepathy, and they can be made to appear before us if as magic. So here again, we are running into the whole magic thing, because again, you've got to go by what people understood at the time, right? And there were people who did incredible things who were just considered magic. So we have several names now for all of these beings, which all have the same characteristics. Fae, gentry, goodfellows, will-o'-the-wisp, a-wisks, daemons, witches, angels, aliens, UAPs, UFOs. We can keep going. What is it? Non-human intelligence, or NHIs? Even though they might be human, because they kind of look like us. So, back in when the Bible was actually being written days, the Hebrews called these beings Sedaim. And when the Greeks started writing stuff down, they transposed the letters and they named them daemonias. And amongst the ancient philosophers, these were to be an aerial race of people which ruled over the elementals. They were mortal, They were engendering and virtually unknown to the people of Earth during the Dark Ages. Which, again, think of the Dark Ages, right? Not only was there a complete blackout on education, but maybe these beings weren't around so much in order just to let us kind of develop as we needed to. The ancient art of Kabbalah taught people to communicate with these beings and how to contact with them. I know someone who had an incredible experience with one of these beings. And this person had no reason to lie to me. This person was not a liar whatsoever. This person was Jewish. They had gone to Jewish schools their entire life, had a couple buddies. One of their buddies basically called them, asked them to go on a quest. There had to be 3 of them in order for this thing to happen. Still not quite understanding what he's doing, but he's happy to be on the ride. And he hears that they are basically going to this remote location in order to talk to a quote-unquote angel or watcher. So they show up in the middle of absolutely nowhere in a different country. I mean, when we're talking about remote, they took a plane and then a bus for a day and a half and then a car for another day and a half. They were remote jungle, middle of nowhere, on a beach. They stood with all their backs to one another in order to find out where this person was coming from. This being appears. It had no hair on its head or face, no eyelashes, no eyebrows, but they said that the being exuded love, unlike which they had ever experienced before. The being basically asked them, I know you're here. What are your questions? Okay, I'll ask my master. Come back here tomorrow. They came back the next day. The being, again, pops up out of nowhere. They're in a remote beach. There was no ingress or egress that they didn't have their eyes on. And this being pops up, and to each of them, who they each had a different foreign language that was their native language, this being spoke their native language, gave them their answer with no accent. So this being was able to be fluent in 4 different languages and knew these things. And the things that the being ended up saying all came true. So that is a real life encounter. I did not have it. It was someone I know. But again, this person has no reason to lie. There was no reason to try to impress me whatsoever. And it came from such out of left field that when I was told this, I went into total shock because this person was such a skeptic with everything, normally. And so to hear this absolutely wild experience that, checks so many boxes, was quite unexpected that evening. But once we see all these different names, right? And we're hearing that we have the ancient art of Kabbalah was taught to people in order for them to communicate with these beings and contact them. Then you have witchcraft, and you have ancient rites that were taught only to secret and protected spiritual practices, secret societies, or secretive societies and or religions that you really had to work your way up. Why? A lot of people don't understand why secret societies or secret religions exist. And I'm going to state it again. Okay? It's because you don't want just anybody having that power and ability to do that. So think of it. What if you have some immature and mean idiot who has the ability to contact these beings and then does something horrible that ends up damaging relations and could possibly end up being our demise, right? Or causing them never to want to touch us again with a 10-foot pole because, oh my God, you have that guy as our ambassador. So this is why. And also there's just the dysregulation within the mindset and the understanding of what it is that you're communicating with and dealing with. You need to be mature. You need to have a level of understanding and a depth of being and understanding and knowing within your soul. And you need to have gone through an initiation period, which sometimes is your whole life completely crumbling and then rebuilding in order to rebuild you better so that you can actually understand these and revere these experiences differently than a 14-year-old kid going into a haunted house and seeing something move and getting scared and running out screaming. Okay? This is why these things have been kept secret and only allowed to be taught to those who have been deemed worthy and properly initiated. And also, a lot of these secret societies and secret religious practices also have age factors. And they have certain things like Kabbalah, for instance, you have to be 40 years old and married and have a steady job, because you need to be rooted in society and have a good head on your shoulders and something to live for in order to properly comprehend what it is that you're about to learn. Because if you're 15 learning this stuff, you could go off the rails. And I've seen that happen with people who've had spiritual awakenings at a very young age. They're not equipped to handle it. And it can have a very dark path impact. And it can lead to a lot of other, self-soothing methods that aren't the best. I think you all know what I'm talking about. And beyond all of that, we have the shock factor. These beings seem to be mighty specific in who it is that they're communicating with. They tend to find honest, good people to help or communicate with. As of the last 70 years, the main message that they've been telling those who they communicate with is tell other people about us. And it's always a positive review. It's never, hey, go tell everyone that I scared the living you-know-what out of you. It's, wow, I felt the most insane amount of love and acceptance and non-judgmental, that I've ever felt in my life. Kind of like near-death experiences where people say, like, I remember that place and that's where I long to go back to, but yet I know I still have a job here. And these beings seem to be loving, educated, non-judgmental about how far behind we are in technology and or even in thinking. With some of the stories where they're basically saying, hey, like, you guys don't really understand your own religion. You don't really even understand what it is to love each other unconditionally. But they didn't say that meanly. They just kind of stated it like, that's where you guys are at. And I know this is trite, but the eating fresh, the fresh water, the people not having to work, hours upon hours upon hours and 15 jobs a day in order to survive. They live and almost offer us a chance at a utopian lifestyle that most of us crave, and I feel that we know exists on some level. And that's why there's this rebellion almost happening currently in the world with this apathy at the way that life is. Every person who's had an encounter with these beings comes back with this intense love and understanding of universal concept of connectedness. They put away all heavy religions and judgments, and they go back to all things are made from God, and therefore we love all things as we are all connected. And this has come up numerous times in transcripts from conversations from contactees within our own governments from FOIA requests. In fact, at one point, there were people who were on watch lists for stating these belief systems in the 40s up into the 1990s. All because there was a thought that if people were spouting these beliefs, potentially that was a calling card of our visiting friends. And it's all about connecting with something higher and not religious. And just think about that for a moment. The profound effect, if we were to take religion and all the divisiveness that it's wrought of our civilization on this planet, and we were to remove that and bring everyone back to, we are all brothers and sisters, we were all created by the same thing, and we are all part of that sameness. And therefore, the light in me honors the light in you. And we love each other. how different would our society be? And I do earnestly and honestly mean it when I say our entire civilization could change in 5 days if everyone got on board. It's just a matter of getting everyone on board. We're working on that, aren't we, team? You know, you guys have to remember, for those of you that are younger, that before the mid to late 1990s, spirituality was really looked upon as like you were part of the fray. You were not normal. People gave you weird looks. Most people had very simple religious beliefs that were not allowed to be questioned. I know far too many people who were kicked out or asked to leave church or Sunday school or whatever, you know, religious stuff they had for kids because they asked holes about things that are in the religious texts. You know, I had questions. Luckily, I just had parents who were able to answer those questions, or state, you know, yeah, that part's misinterpreted, and help me out. But not everyone else did. And isn't it curious that during the 1960s hippie revolution, the government of our country in the United States and many other countries as well that were having the hippie revolution were watching people's behaviors? I mean, there were people who were literally under surveillance, especially when it came to loving others and living in communes. These people were eating well, eating off the land. And yes, of course, there was a ton of drugs, which led to a lot of very ugly things happening during that time. And that's why I'm a huge proponent of not doing drugs, not only because of the physical ailments of what it can do to your physical and spiritual mind, as well as emotions, and just in general, it's not good, okay? But also because it's not needed. You can come to a higher consciousness without leaning on a psychedelic or alcohol or whatever it is that you think, you know, gets you in the zone. All that does is take you to a lower frequency. When you're clean and sober, that takes you to a higher frequency and you're able to connect so much easier. And you're not also, you know, ripping your spiritual web to shreds. It is curious to me, though, the majority of the hippie movement was to, quote unquote, free our minds from the bondage of the hard lines of religions, hate, the daily grind, wars, the hardness of life, and just to love each other. And again, a lot of stuff was twisted with the sexual revolution, right? But the overall premise was to love each other. It just got bastardized with everybody go hump each other, which was not what the original thing meant. But, you know, you have young people and a lot of hormones and everybody getting naked, and we all know it's not going to end well. So, don't recommend. But the main course of the hippie movement was to stop the wars, stop the hate, stop killing each other over useless reasonings, and stop the pain that we inflicted on each other for no reason that makes sense. No sense was made. And I am not... listen, war sometimes is necessary, and I get it. Okay? I'm a huge proponent of that, and I'm very thankful to all of the people that keep our countries safe and that look out for us and all the stuff that they have to endure as a result of letting us live our happy little lives and go to the grocery store without, you know, trembling in fear of what's coming next. And I completely love and I respect that. But again, there's this deep undercurrent within our civilization that there's always been this strife, and let's make everything harder, and I don't like you because you believe this, and I don't like you because you look like that, and I don't like you because you love this or that or the other. It's so ridiculous. We are all family. We are all part of the divine spark that made all of us. And for someone to want to take out other people because they look different, believe different, feel different about certain things is absurd to me. And absurd to me in a way that I don't just, I'm not even just talking religion, I'm talking all of it. Like, even some of the stuff that's been happening in the news, politics, like, oh, if you don't believe what I believe, then you should go to HE double hockey sticks. What in the world? Why would you want to wish that on anybody? Just because they don't believe what you believe? How egotistical and gross is that? Like, calm down. Everybody calm down. I need to calm down. So, I'm going to ask all of you to ask yourself the following questions. Okay? Why is it so weird or strange to love each other in all things? We have been told by literally every religious or spiritual teacher to do so, and yet we keep warring and disliking and hating others because they don't believe what we do. Isn't that curious? Like, it's almost like it's bred within us to do so. Well, not all of us, but a good lot of people. Next question. Why is the concept of there being beings from another dimension, planet, or plane, why is that so difficult for so many people to accept? Now, obviously, it's getting much easier with all the disclosure as of late. Once the government starts getting on board and stating, like, yeah, we got these things, we don't know what they are, people start taking a little bit of a look. But is this blatant, like, I don't want to believe it, or, until a UFO shows up on my front yard and they offer me a sodium-less rice cake, I'm not believing it? Is that because religions have made us so ego-heavy with the expectation that we're God's favorite as long as we believe X, Y, and Z? Or that we're the only creation of God's because the book said so? A book that was written by men, by the way. And out of all space and time, do you really think that we are the first and only peoples? Seriously. Okay? But yet, we could totally wrap our heads around angels impregnating a human lady with the Messiah and, Sky Daddy watching everything that we're doing, but aliens suddenly are demons. What? Oh, I'm having moments. I wrote this yesterday. I'm still having moments with it. What have I said from my beginning episodes? There's been pretty much two things that have constantly come down the line with almost every episode that I've done. The first is we have absolutely no idea how many things we coexist with. We are not the majority. Okay? We need to get that out of our heads that we're the top of the food chain and we're God's favorite, but only if you believe this, right? Also, no fear. Fear creates an opening for dark things to feed off of. Fear creates divisiveness. Fear creates war. Fear creates these weird little rabbit holes of religions that box people in and tell them God loves you, but nobody else that he created because you're special. It makes no sense. Get rid of the fear, and everyone needs to check their ego at the door. If you accept that Jesus was sent by God to help us, okay? So if you're coming from a Christian background, which I know a lot of people are, and that's absolutely fine. And, for the record, I was raised in a Christian metaphysical home, so I have no problem with Christians. I just don't call myself one because in this country, unfortunately, that word has been hijacked and politicized. But I do love Jesus, and I've also been very, very open with that. But if you accept that Jesus Christ was sent by God to help us, then what about all the people, the tens of thousands or millions that came before Jesus came, and all those thousands of years before? Were they all screwed? Are they just sitting in hell or purgatory? Or maybe, just maybe, Jesus came to every different civilization at different times under different names, just like our friendly visitors. And when he came in those different ways and names and bodies, he shared some knowledge, and most of that knowledge was heart-centered love. What about that? I'm gonna let that sink in for a minute. Every single civilization has a story of a man, a woman, who came from kind of nowhere and shared a whole bunch of information and love. They were considered the son of God. They were all martyred. And apparently sharing the good news is a big buzzkill to those who are in power and don't want things to change. What's that remind you of? What's that sound familiar of? The people in power don't want things to change, so they want to keep the status quo. So anybody sharing the good news all of a sudden is discounted or called a liar. Mind you have any disclosure stuff happening? The last and final question I'm going to leave you all with. And I'm going to ask you this twice before the third episode. So in this episode and the second one. What is your concept of God? And I really, really, really need you to think really hard about this, because this is going to come into play later. I've already given you enough that you pretty much know what's coming. I just need to do this in a way that I'm not going to, have people call for me being burned at the stake. Been there, done that. No, thank you. But I would really like you all to think about what is your concept of God. And then I want you to start asking yourselves questions to challenge that belief and see if it still stands with a lot of the questions that I've asked you in the past 5 minutes. And how that belief not only connects you to the divine, but how does that change your perception of your fellow man and fellow beings, right? I'm not just talking to humans. We're all lovely beings. And I love all of you. Thank you for listening to this absolutely long and wild ride. I really hope that you gleaned something from it. I hope that you enjoyed it. And I really look forward to episode 2 and 3. And they are coming. Give me a little bit of time. As you could tell, this is a very lengthy process. But I love and adore all of you. Keep shining.